Some would say that Muddy Waters is the most important blues artist of the second half of the 20th century. He was not only a prime exponent of the Delta blues and a father of electric and Chicago blues, but he is also recognized as one of the founding fathers of rock and roll. Many rock legends performed with him, such as the Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton, The Band, Mike Bloomfield, Paul Butterfield, Rory Gallagher, Steve Winwood, and Georgie Fame. In an illustration of Waters' enormous influence, the Rolling Stones named themselves after a song by him, as did Rolling Stone magazine, and Bob Dylan referenced him in his classic Like a Rolling Stone. Waters was an amazing vocalist, with a passionate yet relaxed, behind-the-beat delivery. Also a marvellous guitarist. He offended blues purists when he switched to the electric guitar, long before Bob Dylan upset folk purists for doing the same thing, and Miles Davis upset jazz purists when he incorporated electric instruments. Waters was a great acoustic player, but his wailing, screeching approach to the electric blues guitar, particularly when using bottleneck, was the most influential. Born in the 1910s, Waters was a contemporary of blues guitarists and singers like Charlie Patton, Robert Johnson, Son House, Lonnie Johnson, Willie Brown, Bessie Smith, who are all regarded as foundational to the genre. But unlike them, Waters was a late bloomer who came to prominence after the Second World War and lived long enough to enjoy fame and recognition in the modern era. In the last decade before his death in 1983, Muddy Waters became a household name. He received 6 Grammy Awards in this decade and was inducted into the Blues Foundation Hall of Fame in 1980. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, and there was a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1992. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame included 4 of his songs in its list of 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. And Rolling Stone magazine placed him at number 17 in their list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. So who was Muddy Waters? What made him so great, and why did it take him so long for him to achieve mainstream success? To start at the beginning, Waters was born as McKinley Morganfield, but there is confusion about the exact date and place. Waters himself claimed that he was born in Rolling Fork, Mississippi in 1915. However, there are historical records that indicate that his birth year may have actually been 1914 or 1913. Today, it is widely assumed that he was born on April the 4th, 1913, in Jugg's Corner in Issaquah County, close to Rolling Fork. McKinley's father, Ollie Morganfield, was a mule driver, but also a talented blues guitarist. He left the family soon after his son's birth, and McKinley's mother, Bertha Jones, died 3 years later. As a result, McKinley was mostly raised by his grandmother, Della Grant. Raising her grandson and her own son on her own was not easy for Grant. The 3 lived at Cottonwood Plantation in Issaquah County, and Grant was a sharecropper, which involved renting a small piece of land from the landowner in exchange for half of the harvest and a deduction for the tools that were used. It was an existence only one step removed from slavery, and quality of life was largely dependent on the personality of the owner. In 1920, when McKinley was 7, Grant moved to the Stovall Plantation near Clarksdale, Mississippi, in search of a more benevolent owner. This location is noteworthy because Clarksdale calls itself the birthplace of the blues. Legends like Willie Brown, Son House, Robert Johnson, John Lee Hooker, and many other blues players were born in or near the town, and Robert Johnson lived there in the 1930s. McKinley reportedly met Johnson. While they were living in Clarksdale, young McKinley's grandmother gave her grandson the nickname Muddy because he loved playing in a rather muddy nearby creek. It is unclear whether she also gave him the name Waters because there are also reports that Muddy was given the additional nickname much later when he began performing. Young Muddy only went to school for 3 years, after which he spent his time helping out in the fields to support his family. Music was one of the few sources of joy and inspiration for people working on plantations, and particularly so for young Muddy. Every Sunday, he went to a Baptist church, and he later recalled that singing there laid the foundation for his vocal style, saying, "I got all of my good moaning and trembling going on for me right out of the church." In addition, a neighbor had a record player, which allowed the young boy to hear music by blues greats such as Tampa Red, Memphis Minnie, and Blind Lemon Jefferson. It had a huge impact on him. People who worked at plantations used every tool and instrument they could find to make music with. And Waters later recalled playing rhythms on cans and buckets and trying to make a guitar out of a box and a stick. Despite objections from his grandmother, who considered the blues devil's music, Muddy also began playing harmonica soon after they arrived at the Stovall plantation. After a few years, he was good enough to perform in the streets to earn extra money. As he grew up, Muddy became increasingly obsessed with music. When he was a teenager, his grandmother bought a record player, which allowed him to listen to recordings by Blind Lemon Jefferson, Charlie Patton, and Son House. Muddy also saw Son House perform at a local jute joint and later recalled that it was a life-changing moment. "I stone got crazy when I seen somebody run down them strings with a bottleneck. My eyes lit up like a Christmas tree and I said I had to learn." However, buying a guitar was not easy for someone living on a sharecropper's near starvation wages. When he was 17, Muddy sold the last horse the family had for $15. He gave half to his grandmother and bought a Stellar guitar for $2.50 from Sears and Roebuck. The first piece he learned to play was How Long the Blues, a piano tune by Leroy Carr. The pounding piano had a strong impact on his playing. Waters remembered, "I saw Charlie Patton in my younger life days. What got me about him was that he was such a good clown man with the guitar, patting it and beating it and putting it behind his neck and turning it over. I loved that, but I loved Son House because he used the bottleneck so beautiful." Practicing hard, Waters soon performed at juke joints around Clarksdale for up to $2.50 per night, in stark contrast to being paid 50 cents per day on the plantation. From the money he earned, he bought another guitar for $14, again from a Sears Roebuck catalogue, and most likely again a Stellar. He continued to play in juke joints and, in addition to his plantation work, earned extra money with illegal activities like fur trapping and moonshining, i.e. distilling alcohol, particularly whiskey. After a while, Waters worked out that he made more money if people came to his cabin, where his alcohol and his music were at the heart of regular wild parties. He rarely slept. For most of the 1930s, Waters' life consisted of this intense schedule. The only change occurred when he went on tour with Big Joe Williams in the early 1930s, playing harmonica. However, he was sacked after a while because, according to Williams, he was talking away my women fans. Waters might have continued working and holding parties at the plantation for the rest of his life, were it not for a stranger who appeared on his porch on Saturday afternoon in August 1941. Waters had heard that a white man was looking for him, and he feared that the authorities were closing in on his bootlegging whiskey activities, so he was extremely suspicious. However, the white man said he wanted to record Waters' music and showed him the Presto Corporation's disc-cutting recording machine in the boot of his car. The blues singer was still mistrustful, but the ice between the two men broke when the white man asked for some water and proceeded to drink it from the same cup as Waters. This was completely unheard of in the segregated South in that time. The white man turned out to be Alan Lomax, an ethnomusicologist and musician who has since become legendary for the tens of thousands of field recordings of folk and blues music he had made over many decades, predominantly in America, but also in Europe. He has been credited with bringing Robert Johnson, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Lead Belly, Jelly Roll Morton, Big Bill Broonzy, and many other now famous artists to a wider audience. In 1941, Lomax was working at the Library of Congress and together with Fisk University music professor John Work, had gone to Clarksdale on a mission to find black musicians who had had the least contact with jazz, the radio, and with the white man, in order to record the original spirit of black music. One of the musicians they had hoped to record was Robert Johnson, but on arrival, they were told the great guitarist had died in 1938. Instead, locals pointed them to another talented local guitarist, Muddy Waters, who they said might be willing to play for them. After the shared glass of water, Waters agreed to be recorded. He used a Martin guitar owned by Lomax and tuned it to an open G, his preferred tuning at that time. When Lomax played him the results back, Waters' life changed. He realized that he sounded just as good as the blues players he'd been listening to all his life.
You know you're gonna miss me, baby, now when I'm dead and gone.
The profound effect of being able to hear one's own music reproduced via recording technology was something Lomax often observed in people he recorded. As he explained in an interview later in his life, the incredible thing is that when you play this material back to people, it changed everything for them. 2 months after the recording session, Lomax sent Waters 2 copies of the recordings and a check for $20, roughly the equivalent of a month's wages. Waters went straight to his local cafe, Will McComb's, and played the discs on the jukebox there. It confirmed his initial euphoric feelings and galvanized his decision to become a professional musician. Waters later said, "I just played it and said, I can do it. I can do it." Lomax returned to Clarksdale in July of 1942 for more recordings with Waters. He performed solo and with the Son Sims 4 ensemble, which consisted of Louis Ford on mandolin and vocals, Henry Sims on violin, and Waters and Percy Thomas on guitar and vocals. Lomax and Work cut all of these recordings to 16-inch glass or aluminium discs, coated with an acetate lacquer, and they had a microphone connected to the Presto 60 recording machine with a lead, making it possible to get close to the performers, resulting in better quality sound. The Presto portable recorder weighed 70 pounds or 30 kilograms, and as the needle cut the lacquer, it threw up very thin threads that were highly inflammable and could get stuck underneath the needle again. Instead of being able to focus on the musicians, the recording engineer had to constantly remove the threads with a brush while the disc was turning. The material from these 3 sessions was released much later in 1966 on Testament Records, on the album Down on Stovall's Plantation, and again in 1993 on Chess Records, with additional takes and added interviews with Waters on the Complete Plantation recordings, the historic 1941-42 Library of Congress field recordings. The recordings are very much in the acoustic Delta blues style that was also pioneered by Robert Johnson. Waters realized that making it as a musician required a move to a big city, and he initially tried St. Louis, but found it overwhelming and soon found himself back at Stovall Plantation, again working for 25.5 cents an hour. In 1943, Waters tried for a second time, this time moving to Chicago, which had become the main urban center for blues in the US around that time. He arrived with a Silvertone acoustic guitar and a suitcase, and initially made ends meet as a truck driver and playing house parties and small clubs. Although Waters' talents were recognized by Big Bill Brunsey and opened shows for him, to his disappointment, he had found there was not a lot of demand for traditional Delta blues, and it appeared as if his Chicago move would prove as ill-fated as his St. Louis misadventure. However, where his saving grace appeared in 1941 as a white man, soon after he arrived in Chicago, it came in the shape of an electric guitar. Records again conflict about this momentous event, with some stating that his uncle gave him the electric guitar and others having it that Waters bought one. Whatever way, obtaining an electric guitar was a career-changing event. It not only allowed Waters to make himself heard in the places he was performing, but also to create a new approach to playing the guitar, in which he combined the influences from the founders of the blues with those of contemporary musicians. In doing so, Waters gave birth to the Chicago blues sound, with the electric guitar center stage rather than used as an instrument for accompaniment. Waters' electric blues was loud, optimistic and outgoing, in contrast to the more introverted and melancholic blues that went before him. It did not take long for Waters to become one of the most prominent musicians in Chicago, and to be spotted by record companies. In 1946, he recorded a few cuts with an acoustic ensemble for Columbia Records, but his name was not mentioned on the release. Later, in that same year, he recorded some tracks together with pianist Sunnyland Slim for a new label called Aristocrat Records, founded by brothers Phil and Leonard Chess. He again recorded for the label in 1948, and two tracks he recorded that year, I Can't Be Satisfied and I Feel Like Going Home, became hits, placing the by now 35-year-old man on the map as an up-and-coming blues artist.
Going back down south, child, don't you wanna go, woman, I'm trouble.
Around this time, he played a Gretsch in which he had a DeArmond FCH pickup fitted. Waters' next few releases on Aristocrat did not do much, but in 1950 the label transformed into Chess Records, which went on to become one of the most famous and influential labels in the history of the blues. Waters' first release on Chess, most likely recorded at Universal Studios in Chicago, was a song that has since become legendary. It was called Rolling Stone.
Swimming in a deep blue sea.
The recording was Waters' version of the traditional Delta blues tune, Catfish Blues, and he performed it singing accompanied by his Gretsch in standard tuning, which he was to use for the rest of his career. Although Rolling Stone did not chart, it still sold 70,000 copies, which was enough for Waters to quit his day job. Over time, the song had enormous impact beyond the bluesman's career, as it was the song that the Rolling Stones named themselves after, and it provided the inspiration for Jimi Hendrix's Catfish Blues, which was his tribute to Waters. Voodoo Child and Voodoo Child Slight Return were further developments of the song. Waters himself also used the song as the foundation for his 1951 release, Still a Fool, which reached to number 9 on the American R&B chart. Chess released up to 4 songs a year by Waters during this time, and other charting songs included Louisiana Blues, Long Distance Call, She Moves Me, Turn the Lamp Down Low, Baby Please Don't Go, and in 1954 another of his signature songs, I'm Your Hoochie Coochie Man, a blues standard originally written by Willie Dixon. It was followed a year later by Mannish Boy, which was based on Bo Diddley's I'm a Man. Hoochie Coochie Man has been performed by Chuck Berry, Jimi Hendrix, B.B. King, Buddy Guy, Eric Clapton, and many others. Both Hoochie Coochie Man and Mannish Boy were included in the list of 500 songs that shaped rock and roll, and in the Rolling Stones list of 500 greatest songs of all time. As the 50s wore on, Waters switched to a 1952 Gibson Les Paul Gold Top, with P90 pickups as his main guitar. For his recording sessions, he was also often accompanied by other musicians, including Jimmy Rogers on guitar, Fred Below on drums, Willie Dixon on bass, Little Walter on harmonica, and Otis Spann on piano. They were all members of a band that Waters had formed in Chicago in the late 1940s that wiped the floor with all other bands in town. They clearly enjoyed their killing it reputation. As Waters later explained, we called ourselves the Headhunters because we'd go in and if we got a chance, we're going to burn them. The band has been called the prototypical rock band, and many of its members went on to have stellar careers of their own. Waters continued to enjoy major success with a string of singles during the 1950s, including Got My Mojo Working in 1957, a blues standard written by Preston Foster. The song received a Grammy Hall of Fame award in 1999 and was named one of the Songs of the Century by the RIAA. A compilation album containing many of his singles from the era, The Best of Muddy Waters, was released in 1956. By the end of the 50s, Waters' run of single hits was beginning to dry up, and looking for new challenges, he toured England, together with pianist Otis Spann. However, in a precursor of the controversy generated in the late 60s when Dylan and Miles went electric, Waters' tour turned out to have some unexpected challenges. He arrived armed with his 1957 red Fender Telecaster, while English blues audiences expected him to play traditional Delta blues on an acoustic guitar. The opening night in Leeds was a disaster, with headlines like "Screaming Guitar and Howling Piano" and "Coarse and Repetitive," accompanied by the more traditional jazz musicians, in part from the Chris Barber Jazz Band. Waters and Spann turned the volume down for the rest of the tour, and when they played London a couple of days later, reactions were more positive. Only during an impromptu performance a week later in London, at the invitation of blues musician Alexis Corner, did Waters really let loose. As one critic wrote, he sang with the whole body, gyrating, twisting, shouting, preaching the blues, chorus upon hypnotic chorus, weaving a pattern of quivering tension around and over an enthralled audience. Waters left a lasting impression that filtered through on many levels of the English music scene, including teenage schoolboys with names like Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, Jimmy Page, Pete Townsend, Eric Burdon, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Peter Green, and Northern Irishman Van Morrison. They all spent a lot of their time listening to obscure blues records that included Muddy Waters, with particularly the best of Muddy Waters in high demand. On his return to Chicago, Waters continued to perform in venues there with his live band, which now featured James Cotton on harmonica, Andrew Stevens on bass, Francis Clay on drums, Otis Spann on piano, and Pat Hare on guitar. Hare was one of the first guitarists to use distortion on purpose. He was regarded as one of the forerunners of hard rock and heavy metal. This band recorded Waters' first proper studio album, Muddy Waters Sings Big Bill, in 1959. It was released in June of 1960 as one of the first albums in stereo. A month later, on July the 3rd, 1960, Waters and his band performed at the Newport Jazz Festival.
The gypsy woman told my mother before I was born.
And a recording was released by Chess Records later that year, with Waters posing with John Lee Hooker's Harmony Monterey Archtop semi-acoustic guitar, rather than the red Telecaster that he actually played. The live album at Newport 1960 was very influential with budding blues and rock musicians at the time, particularly in the UK, and is regarded as one of the most indispensable blues records of all time. And it's been listed among the 100 essential albums of the 20th century. For the remainder of the 60s, Waters was involved in a wide variety of projects, in different styles and with different musicians, in part because his live band was going through a succession of personnel changes. For example, guitarist Pat Hare ended up in prison for the murder of his wife, but mostly because Chess Records was eager to capitalize on Waters' popularity and pushed to repackage him in various ways, with varying degrees of success. Some projects proved contentious. In the early 1960s, Chess Records signed a deal with Electro Voice and replaced most of its older RCA, Neumann, and electric Altec microphones with Electro Voice microphones like the 635A, which was used on bass, the 649B and the 666, and the RE15. The latter two were used on vocals. The company also acquired a 3M Wollensack tape recorder. The equipment was used to record Folk Singer. Released in 1964, it was entirely acoustic, with Waters playing a 1959 Martin 0018E. He was accompanied by Buddy Guy on guitar, Willie Dixon on string bass, and Clifton James on drums.
Well, I know my little baby.
Reviews at the time were negative and sales poor, but in recent years the album has enjoyed a critical reassessment and is now regarded as one of Waters' best. Brass and the Blues from 1966 was the first attempt to go for a popular modern sound, with the addition of brass and organ and a move away from blues. However, it was critically panned on its release, and ever since. Waters later remarked, "My blues look so simple, so easy to do, but it's not. They say my blues is the hardest blues in the world to play, and it proved when musicians were invited to play with him who did not really have any feeling for his blues." In 1967, Waters cut an album with several blues superstars, including Bo Diddley, Buddy Guy, and harmonica player Little Walter. It was called Super Blues and contained fairly rough and ready studio jams and was not particularly well received. A year later, the exercise was repeated with the Super Blues Band, featuring Howling Wolf instead of Little Walter, and the chaotic results have been called a stylistic train wreck. By this point, Waters was also playing a Gibson SG Junior, and he was sometimes seen with a 1963 Guild Thunderbird S200 and a 1966 S200, which were the result of an endorsement deal he had with Guild. However, his 1957 Red Telecaster, which he nicknamed the Hoss, remained his main guitar. He fitted it with Gibson medium gauge strings, 12 to 56. After having used a large variety of small amps, Waters settled around this time on a Silverface 40-watt Fender Super Reverb as his main amp, with all the settings at 9 and with no tremolo or reverb used. Waters' next solo album, Electric Mud, released in 1968, is his most controversial, as Chess Records supposedly tried to cash in on Waters' stellar reputation among young rock musicians. Marshall Chess, the son of one of the two Chess Records owners, was one of the producers on the album, and he said that he had assembled the hottest, most avant-garde rock guys in Chicago. Among them was Pete Cozy, who would, during 1973 and 75, cause controversy when he played electric guitar for Miles Davis, with some of the most outlandish playing in the history of the electric guitar. Phil Upchurch and Roland Faulkner also played guitar on Electric Mud, but Waters only appeared on vocals. Waters was 53 when the album was made, and the distorted, psychedelic vibe might have sounded okay to those steeped in the hippie culture of the day, but for everyone else, it seemed the wrong fit. Like Miles Davis and Bob Dylan, Waters was accused of selling out, and critics called the album the nadir of Waters' career. And one noted, this can't be Muddy Waters with all this going on, all this wah-wah and fuzz tone. Waters himself later disowned the album and called it. However, Electric Mud sold well, and it was Waters' first to end up in the mainstream charts, and over time its reputation has grown. Jimi Hendrix reportedly played one of the tracks before going on stage as a source of inspiration. John Paul Jones has said the album inspired the riff for Led Zeppelin's Black Dog, and rapper Chuck D of Public Enemy has become a huge public fan, telling everyone who wants to listen that it had a major impact on early hip-hop. Co-producer Marshall Chess contends to this day that the album is brilliant and misunderstood. Waters himself almost certainly initially had positive feelings about Electric Mud because he went into the studio a year later with largely the same musicians and producers to record After the Rain, released in 1968. It is less distorted and psychedelic, features many of his own songs and his guitar playing, and is far less controversial. Chess continued trying to connect Waters with a younger audience for his next album, also released in 1969, Father and Sons, which contained both live and studio material, featuring ace guitarist Mike Bloomfield, top harmonica player Paul Butterfield, bass legend Donald Duck Dunn, and several great musicians. It is a return to a more traditional blues approach and became Waters' biggest selling album, reaching number 70 on the Billboard charts. During the 1970s, Waters continued to tour and release albums, and his activities could increasingly be seen as an extended lap of honor. He received his 6 Grammy Awards, all in the Best Ethnic or Traditional Folk Recording category during his last decade, and often played with famous rock musicians. The decade began with the release of a compilation album, They Call Me Muddy Waters, for which he received his first Grammy. Next up, with a well-received live album with the Waters' own live band, Live at Mr. Kelly's, which was released in 1971. At the end of the year, Waters travelled to England for yet another attempt to try to link him up with the young culture of the day. He recorded an album at IBC Studios in London with several famous musicians from the British Isles. Among them were guitarist Rory Gallagher. keyboardists Georgie Fame and Steve Winwood, and Jimi Hendrix's former drummer Mitch Mitchell. The result of the London Muddy Waters sessions has been called tepid and a money gig from the get-go, though it is regarded far more positively today. The album sounds more in your face than other Waters releases, with a rock aesthetic which led Waters to complain, "It ain't Muddy Waters' sound, and if you change my sound, then you're going to change the whole man." The album nevertheless won him his second Grammy Award. Waters recorded 3 more studio albums for Chess. The first 2, Can't Get No Grinding in 1973 and Unk in Funk in 1974, featured his regular live band, which included pianist Pinetop Perkins, another signed man who became a legendary musician in his own right. Chess had tried to steer Waters for a decade to a more contemporary direction and into collaborations with rock musicians, but ironically, these last 2 albums on the label contained classic blues. Waters' third and final album for Chess, the Muddy Waters Woodstock album, features keyboardist Garth Hudson and drummer Levon Helm from the band, as well as Paul Butterfield and members of Waters' own band. It was recorded at Levon Helm's studio in Woodstock, hence the title, and has been called a soulful swan song to the label where he got his start. Released in 1975, it earned Waters his 3rd Grammy. A year later, Waters appeared on stage with the band at their famous The Last Waltz concert, which was immortalised by Martin Scorsese in the feature film of the same name, with Waters also making an appearance. Chess Records was sold in 1975 and became a reissue label, so Waters signed with Blue Sky, a sub-label of Columbia. His last 3 solo albums and a live album appeared on this label, all produced by star guitarist Johnny Winter. The first album, Hard Again, on which Waters is accompanied by his live band, including guitarist Bob Margolin, pianist Pinetop Perkins, and harmonica player James Cotton, is widely regarded as a triumph and an essential recording. Released in 1977, it earned him his 4th Grammy. Waters and Winter redid the entire exercise on I'm Ready, which was released in 1978, which again was well received and also earned a Grammy. A recording of the live tour promoting Hard Again called Muddy Mississippi Waters Live was released in 1979 and resulted in Waters' 6th Grammy. The 3rd studio album Waters recorded with Winters, King Bee, was released in 1980 and less successful as Waters' health had begun to deteriorate. Waters' Lap of Honor continued with a performance at the Chicago Fest in 1981 with Johnny Winter and drummer Buddy Miles, and in November of that year he appeared with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood at the Checkerboard Lounge Blues Club in Chicago. Both performances were released much later on DVD. Waters had been on tour with Eric Clapton in 1979, and the bluesman's last public performance took place on June 30th, 1982, when he sat in with Eric Clapton's band during a concert in Florida. Waters died from cancer-related heart failure on April the 30th at his home in Westmont, Illinois. He was 70 years old. He was buried in Restvale Cemetery, Alsip, Illinois, on May the 4th. While Waters' voice and guitar fell silent, his legacy and influence continues to this day. He has been name-checked and his songs covered by countless musicians, including Elvis Presley, The Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, the Allman Brothers, Paul Rodgers, Gary Moore, Bonnie Raitt, Brian May, Supertramp, Chuck Berry, Queen, Steppenwolf, AC/DC, Billy Gibbons, B.B. King, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and many, many others. The young boy who liked mud and water changed the history of music, not only by revolutionizing the blues, but also by laying the foundations of rock and roll. In this context, one could argue that rather than at number 17, his place is somewhere near the top of the list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. What can I say? I bought Hard Again when I was 11, and what an incredible gateway drug into, I don't know, just amazing music, blues. Hard Again is an absolute masterpiece. Johnny Winter just knew how to get the best out of Muddy. Listen to that album. Listen to Muddy Waters' vocal timing on it. It is insane. It doesn't matter what the groove of the band is. He just sits just behind the groove, just behind the beat. It feels so good. When he does I Can't Be Satisfied, that it's so good. And it's so well recorded. Johnny Winter did an amazing job. It's incredible. So that is like the gateway drug. I'm 11 years old. I get Hard Again. And I did what pretty much everybody did. I took the train to London. Yes, at 11 I was going by train from my village. I don't know. It was a different time, wasn't it? I got on the train, went to London, and I went to the Notting Hill Record and Tape Exchange. Before it became the Notting Hill Record, Tape and Video Exchange. Goodness knows what it's called now. DVD? I don't know. Anyway, I went there and I went to the Muddy Waters section and I bought the cheapest albums, used albums I could buy. And I had read about Folk Singer and, of course, the Newport album. And I bought them one at a time. I only had enough money to buy one. And I bought Muddy Waters Live at Newport Jazz Festival. I bought that first, and then I came back and bought Folk Singer. I bought Folk Singer, and not only did I discover Muddy Waters, I discovered Buddy Guy. I put a photo up about 2 months ago of tickets I've collected over the years, and there's lots of Buddy Guy. I've seen Buddy Guy play countless times. I've seen him play with his brother Phil Guy, for those of you that are blues aficionados. Huge fan. So Muddy is like Miles, isn't he? He's like everybody that came through and played with Muddy Waters went off and did something incredible as well. As we talked about, he really is like Miles Davis in that respect. But Muddy, he had it all. He had a voice and a groove and a feel that was unbelievable. And like we've been quoting him during this episode, he had such a unique sound, such an incredible sound. Go and listen to Hard Again. If you don't know Muddy Waters, just start with that because it's a more modern sounding record and it will just open up the world to you. Then you can go and get Folk Singer and Newport, and you can just keep going. Incredible songwriter, incredible performer, and you just feel the love in his music. It sounds like he's got a smile on his face when he's singing. He's just like, I never got to see him live. Never got to see him live. He had stopped playing live and wasn't playing in the UK by the time I was seeing shows. Even though I was seeing shows just before he died as a little kid, he hadn't played a show in England, at least not a headlining one, so I never got to see him live, which is horrible. I got to see Albert King, I got to see so many incredible artists, but I didn't get to see him. Saw Johnny Winter. So Muddy, thank you for the incredible music you gave us. Please, if you don't know Muddy Waters, go check him out. He's so amazing. Thank you ever so much for watching. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, adios, auf Wiedersehen, tschüss, hedor, dos vidania, I'm forgetting some, I'm really, goodbye. Thanks ever so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. Have a marvellous time. Thank you. Please, leave a whole bunch of questions and comments below and tell us what other artists we need to finish. Muddy is incredible. Such a blessing to do this. Thank you.